As you all know, my name is Lisa Snyder. I'm here from UCLA, and I have been given a very difficult task for this morning, which is to try to describe in 20 minutes or less what we as 3D visualization scholars do. And I say that's a challenge because there isn't any one single approach to 3D projects. Scholars using 3D for their research comes from all manner of disciplines, have a broad range of research questions, and make wildly different technological choices. So we have archaeologists and classicists who may embrace photogrammetry to document their current excavations. And here's an example. It's Nicolas Le Carré's photogrammetric model of Catel Hayuk, which was generated by drones capturing imagery and high-performance computing clusters meshing the images together to create 3D geometry. Historians may want to use an online virtual world to recreate a significant event. And here we see the Battle of Mount Street Bridge. Filmmakers may be interested in virtual reality as a new form of mass communication. And this is an example of Alejandro Inarritu's VR piece, Flesh and Sand. Lynn, did you have a chance to see that?
No, they would not let the pleats in.
Oh.
You had to have a high level to get in that.
Ouch. And public historians may want to use augmented reality to spark community engagement with a particular place. And here's Ed Johnston's Augmented Asbury Park project. Now granted, I'm using the very broadest possible definitions of virtual worlds, but that's the nature of the field right now. And the common thread, however, is that at the heart of all of this is some form of 3D content. And this is one of the buildings from my Columbian Exposition project. So my presentation this morning is going to be in three basic chunks. First, I'm going to share a bit of history with you about cultural heritage visualizations. Then, for those of you who are not involved in 3D modeling, I'm going to talk a bit about the reconstruction process and how I do it, so that I hope when others are talking about their work, you have a bit of an insight into that. And then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts to keep in mind as we work together in the next 2 days. So digital 3D reconstruction is a very new field, but remember that physical reconstructions have existed for hundreds of thousands of years. You know, people making maquettes of architectural building projects or reconstructing archaeological sites on site. And those have their own kind of areas of doubt and questions, and we can talk about those throughout the day. Now, Robert Daniels Dwyer claims that the oldest British digital 3D reconstruction project was a solid model of a Roman temple precinct in Bath and a legionary baths complex in Wales, and that these were done in the mid-1980s, both produced by John Woodard and Adrian Boyer at the School of Engineering at the University of Bath. And Woodard went on to join IBM's Scientific Centre in the UK and create a model of the Old Minster in Winchester, which was completed in 1986. And so you can imagine this is a very, compared to what we've seen in the lightning talks, a very crude example of what a 3D reconstruction project might look like. As Fisher et al. Recount in their 2000 conference paper documenting the past, present, and future of cultural virtual reality, a wave of projects emerged in the 1990s as hardware and graphics processors became more accessible. Among these early efforts was the Virtual Pompeii project, which was done by the Sim Lab at Carnegie Mellon and was installed in the De Young Museum in San Francisco for about 4 months in late 1995, early 1996. And though partially funded by the Archaeological Institute of America, Fisher notes that no professional Pompeianists are known to have been consulted when the project was in its inception, nor to have had any major input on the final project. Predictably, professional archaeologists and art historians were not impressed. I'm quite convinced that it was these early types of projects, promoted by computer scientists and hardware companies rather than academics, that laid the seeds for the scholarly ambivalence and distrust, really, of cultural heritage visualizations that we experience today. Now, a side note on the hardware from those days, and I think Costas invited me because I'm old enough to have lived through those days. And I want to throw this in because we're spoiled now by the power of modern computers. So back in the 1980s and 90s, these types of visualizations, as I said, were dominated by computer scientists and hardware manufacturers. It wasn't about the humanist question. The costs were incredibly high for these types of projects, and they were technically incredibly challenging. So UCLA has a very long cultural history, or long connection with this type of cultural heritage visualization. In the late 90s, a UCLA team built a reconstruction of Trajan's Forum for the 1997 inaugural exhibition at Getty Center in Los Angeles. And I would tell you, pulling the slides for this image, I was wincing looking at the visuals of the reconstruction model that's shown at the right. So this was PIs were Bernie Fisher and Diane Favreau. I was working with the urban simulation team, and as a graduate student, I was one of the 2 modelers that worked on this project. So at the time, it wasn't feasible to run the modern model interactively in the installation. So we created a movie about that process. And even to capture the animated sequences to make the film, we had to rent special equipment. It had to be trucked in for the day. We only had it for a single day, and we could capture the frames and produce the movie. And like Virtual Pompeii, the exhibit was problematic for critics. So from the Los Angeles Times, the art critic said, "Dominating one gallery, an immense screen presents a digitally engineered reconstruction of what scholars currently think Trajan's awe-inducing forum looked like. Surrounding the projection screen, big sculpture fragments from the forum and its era are displayed on the gallery floor and walls." So you can imagine a smallish room about this size with a big screen of that brightly colored model and then artifacts around. Imagine actual works of antique Roman art, given a subsidiary role, are offered up as evidence to flesh out virtual reality. Classical sculpture is relegated to the supporting cast, while a star turn is performed by the same sort of digital magic that gave us Jurassic dinosaurs and the science fiction insects that have lately threatened cinematic star troopers and men in black. Goodbye, high art. Hello, high technology. So equipment, I'm still on this flashback. Equipment was purchased so that our next installation could be run in real time. And this was in 2001 that we were doing this installation. And I'll say a bit more about that, I'm sure, later. But suffice it to say, we had a silicon graphics computer, and that's what we needed to run the model. We had, for you techie geeks, we had an SGI Onyx 2 IR3, Infinite Reality 3 graphics subsystem. And at the point we put that installation in, the computer cost well over $250,000 for the computer. And because of the setup requirements, SGI had to ship the computer to us. It was on a huge shipping pallet. It was about, a square meter. We had to load the software, we had to load the model, and then we had to ship it to Israel. Now, today, you could download the same content from Box in less than a minute and run it on your phone. So times have changed. So back to what 3D scholars do. Now, I'm an architectural historian, and my research is focused on the uses of interactive computer models for teaching about architecture in urban environments. Basically, how one might use 3D models as instructional technology. I'm interested in the circumstances under which students and instructors will embrace this kind of technology for teaching. And as you can imagine, the kind of technological, methodological, and theoretical choices that I've made over the years have been framed by my discipline, architectural history, and my research objectives, teaching and learning. So to truly wrap my head around the pedagogical applications for the technology, I had to become a modeler myself. And I have spent far too many years on a reconstruction model of the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. Are any of you familiar with this? A handful, I'm sure. It's a World's Fair that was held in Chicago in 1893 So if you remember the Crystal Palace in London, 1851, a series of World's Fairs, and then one hit Chicago in 1893. And I'd like to share a bit with you right now about my process so you get a sense of it, of what I do and why, and hopefully that will, again, give you some insights into this form of knowledge production that you'll be able to understand the process as we continue our talks through the next few days. So the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. This is a map from the Newberry Library in Chicago. It was a huge World's Fair centered around a very formal court of honor here, with big exhibition halls throughout here ringing the wooded island, and then up in this area, country and state buildings for fairgoers, and the long Midway Plaisance, which was where kind of a pleasure zone was. This was where, you know, the hoochie coochie dancers, and the first Ferris wheel was out there on the Midway. It's incredibly important in American history because it was really the first grand architectural urban vision that was presented to much of the country, and it sparked the City Beautiful movement, the American Renaissance, incredibly important in urban planning, in women's studies, in architecture, in religious studies. So it's an incredibly important monument in American history, yet it was incredibly ephemeral. It was only intended to last for 6 months, and the buildings included salvage costs. So people are going to come in, buy the steel, buy the iron used for the construction of the great exhibit halls, and then it was gone. There's one building that still remains on site, and I might show you that a bit later. So just to give you a sense of the construction process of one particular building, this is the transportation building. So it was the first fair to include an exhibit hall devoted to transportation. It was designed by an American architectural team, Adler and Sullivan, and architecturally probably one of the most interesting of the buildings. So I spent 6 months reconstructing this particular building. Now it's slightly different because my endpoint is an interactive computer model as opposed to a rendered illustration or rendered animated clip. So the visuals are slightly different, but step one, for those of you not involved in this, is research. Research, research, research. Maybe steps 1 through 5 are research. And that involves collecting everything you might possibly find about this particular building, whether it's textual information, plans, drawing sections, elevations, photographs, as many as possible, if there are any remaining fragments, all the information one might possibly find about that particular building. And then we move into beginning the basic massing, just kind of beginning to throw together what the forms are based on the dimensions. Luckily, I had measured drawings, so based on the dimensions, throwing it together, beginning to add in detail, beginning to take, you know, these kinds of areas which are just kind of blobby nothings, and beginning to articulate the forms, and beginning to look at texture maps and imagery. And in this particular case, I had to look at coloration. 1893 is before color photography, so I had to rely on text evidence. I had to rely on watercolors, illustrations, printed books that had been hand-tinted, printed lantern slides that had been hand-tinted, oil paintings, and so on, to try to come to the final coloration scheme for this. I looked at contemporary examples of the architects and their stenciling and their palettes, and in fact tried to do a reverse engineer. If I take an extant color sample from a stencil by the same architect and make it black and white, does that tell me anything about moving black and white to color? As it turns out, no. But and then I began to look at materials. So here a contemporary building by the same architects. What does the exterior statues look like? What's the palette in comparison to contemporary things and the finished building? So my question to you, is this knowledge production? I would argue yes. I would argue that the reconstruction process itself is a type of academic argument that hits on every one of John Unsworth's scholarly primitives: discovering, annotating, comparing, referring, sampling, illustrating, representing, selecting, linking, all of the above. This model is a critical representation of the wealth of source materials that informed its production. You're nodding, so yes, I hope you agree. How about my research on pedagogical uses for this kind of interactive models? I would say yes, that's knowledge production. How about the software that we've developed to support classroom use of these models? Following Alan Gailey and Stan Rucker's examination of how a prototype argues, I would again say yes. But all of this is a significantly different format than traditional scholarship and doesn't fit easily into our traditional notions of publishing. So here's the rub. As a scholar, I want my work to be part of the academic record. Not ephemeral, not fade away in 6 months. I want it to be published. I want it to be sustained. I want it to be peer-reviewed. I want it to be considered in the same conversations as other forms of academic output. And I want it to be cited by my colleagues in my discipline. And I want others to be able to build their work off of my scholarship. Now, I will admit I'm in an administrative position at UCLA, so this is not critical for me, but for my academic peers, it's also important that this kind of work account for promotion and tenure. Getting there is the challenge, and that's partially why we're here. So in reviewing the agenda today, I decided we've got a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Our discussion seems to boil down to two main questions, but it's kind of uncertain to me which comes first, and we can discuss this, and you can tell me I'm completely full of it if you disagree. So on one hand, we have the question of mechanics of publication and peer review of this kind of content. In part, I think that's simply an infrastructure question. What kind of publishing platforms do we need to deliver the multiplicity of possible projects in their native environments? So how do I publish what I've done and also preserve the interactivity of the medium? And I think this is a very important point. As Patrick Saul has written, a scholarly digital edition cannot be expressed in print without a significant loss of content or functionality. And this certainly describes the situation with our 3D work. But it's also a cultural question. How do we integrate new modes of scholarship into our existing notions of knowledge production and have them accepted by our disciplines? And I also think it's a resource question. How do we find reviewers to critique this kind of work? And in my experience, this has been a challenge, but I may be overthinking it a bit, but I have asked scholars, I've pulled together scholarly committees and said, look, here's what I've done on the transportation building, and here's all the source material, and what do you think? And give me comments, I'd love your feedback. And they look at it and go, yeah.
It's really pretty.
Yeah, it looks lovely. Yay. And it's almost so in the weeds that it's beyond typical academics.
Unless you're working with an academic rival who didn't get the funding and then shred every pixel.
Exactly.
But maybe that's just art historians.
Nope, I'm sure it is. I mean, fundamentally, peer review validates the research question, the methodology, the execution, and decides whether that objective is important to the discipline and whether the project or the model meets its objective, theoretically. We just need to figure out how to apply that process to 3D work, which leads me to the other hand, which is the packaging question. What needs to happen to transform our virtual environments into an article or book equivalent, into a scholarly digital edition? You know, how do we make our virtual worlds legible to readers, acceptable to reviewers? What's the audience? Is it a lay audience? Is it a student audience? Is it a professional audience looking for reuse of the digital content? I do think annotation here is key, but the devil is in the details. What exactly are we annotating? How can we use annotation to justify the modeling process? How do we make that process of production transparent? Is it text-based? Is it visual-based? I have argued elsewhere that our in-world documentation needs to accommodate source materials, introductory information for users, paradata that explains interpretive decisions, academic argumentation, and paratextual markup. But that list may not be suitable for all virtual projects. And other content creators may want to annotate their models through visual strategies, changes to the building of sites over time. There are so many different options that it's a challenge. And I think these two questions are at the heart of our conundrum right now. What Kate Hales might describe as a Pandora's box of complexity and contradiction. And my sense is that these two questions need to be resolved together, simultaneously, and I think this masterclass is a great step toward that resolution. So before we start our conversations and before we continue, I want to conclude with, I think, 5 thoughts that remind you of the challenges that 3D research presents, challenges that I think will likely flavor our discussions about scholarly editions in the next 2 days. The first that I want to remind you is to keep in mind the multiplicity of disciplines. I mentioned this at the onset, but I think it bears repeating. There are so many different approaches to 3D content and what might be necessary from a scholarly digital edition that we might need to think about focusing a bit. I think we're all here really looking at heritage visualization, which is a subset of 3D scholarship defined by the London Charter as the use of computer-based visualization as a means of researching and communicating cultural heritage. Many of us are from the world of DH, and much of our work revolves around teaching and learning, museology, and public engagement. But I think it's important to keep this in mind because we all have a very different mindset with different research objectives and certainly different ideas about dissemination and publishing. And even within this small group of cultural heritage scholars, there are technological challenges to consider. We have available to us an enviable array of technologies, which is wonderful in that it allows us to kind of tailor our work to the students we have, to the budgets we have, to the research objectives. But on the downside, this also means that we as a community have no agreed upon standards for 3D research. There is no one single piece of software that everyone uses, no player or interface that's ubiquitous, and no standard file formats. And our research projects exist across the spectrum. There are small-scale projects developed in class with student labor, maybe using SketchUp. There are larger-scale projects that have multiple collaborators and funding, maybe using 3D Studio Max. There are projects that use photogrammetry, like Photoscan here. So when we talk about developing publishing platforms in the peer review process, I think these are differences that we need to acknowledge. How does a manually built reconstruction model compare academically to a laser scan, or a model generated photogrammetrically or algorithmically? How do you tease out the scholarship in those very different processes? And I think the same questions apply to the chosen display mechanism. How do you compare a desktop VR project to one projected in a cave or experienced in an online virtual world or with an Oculus Rift or an HTC Vive or through an augmented reality app? Again, very different. I think we also have some very, very difficult user interface challenges that don't exist in the kind of more linear print and web world. First, there's the general question of interaction. What do we want people to do in our virtual world? Is it enough to have a spin the artifact moment? For me, no. I want you to be able to explore over 800 square acres of an exposition. It's a very, very difficult technical challenge. What kind of gear is required? We've already talked a bit about annotation, but we have a technical challenge there. How do we annotate virtual worlds in a way that delivers information to users just in time during an interactive exploration or as a linear argument through virtual space? How do you trigger information within a virtual environment or accommodate spatially linked information that's view dependent? How do you accommodate multimedia information and primary and secondary source material? I will tell you that in this regard, I am completely envious of the relatively simple 2D solutions that exist for things like GIS people. So here's Esri story maps. I have some multimedia, I have a map, I want to tell a story. Pick a template. There's no such template for 3D work. And we do have that representation problem. The early discourse, by which I mean articles from the 1990s, is full of debates about the rendering styles, alternate reconstructions, strategies for color coding and rendering geometry at different levels of transparency to display different levels of uncertainty within the model. And all of our guiding theoretical principles we've mentioned are documented in the London and Seville charters. And even in the call for the Masterclass, there was the mention of that critique of models as deceiving users with their high visual stimuli, noting that over the years there have been several attempts to illustrate ambiguity and make the process of production more transparent. But the inverse is also true and also a problem. So that which is not visually appealing is often dismissed, even by our most knowledgeable colleagues. I know that my target audience, students, have incredible expectations for visual material, which have been formed by their experiences with Hollywood, with high budget games, and I just can't imagine how many times I've heard like, oh my God, I come from Los Angeles, right? So, oh my God, I totally love Assassin's Creed, but this is stupid. Because it's night and day, a world of difference. I would be very interested, I've not done this research, as to which of these four models shown here, this is the Basilica of Maxentius in the Roman Forum, which of these students would rate as more historically accurate, or which your colleagues might rate as more historically accurate. Of course, it's exactly the same model, just rendered with different skin. And we also have a comparison problem. If the standard bearer of the academic world is the monograph, what is the virtual world's equivalent? What would constitute an article equivalent? And how do we even consider virtual worlds as text? Is that even the right point of comparison? One particularly problematic thing for me is, what do peer review rulings from the print world mean in a 3D world? What are the appropriate expectations for a revise and resubmit ruling when you're dealing with a virtual environment? Loved the model, but I think you need, I had $1 million of funding, or €1 million funding 3 years ago. I can't replicate anything right now. Thank you so much. It's just not realistic. So what does an accept with revision mean for a virtual environment? Can you change that texture to a different stone? That one looks a little gray to me. It's just not realistic, and people who don't do 3D worlds don't get that problem because they've not been in the trenches making those decisions. And technically, what does the peer review apparatus look like in a virtual world? Do we need to accommodate, and I think we do, actually, in-world markup for reviewers? If I'm able to navigate through a world and I have a comment about this particular shrine temple, I need to be able to mark where I'm at, what's the issue, what's my question about that. And finally, perhaps most importantly, this is just a fear of mine, I worry about limitations on the types of research questions that can be explored in virtual environments. If we can convince our colleagues that the reconstruction process is scholarship, great. Then our publications can focus on the process, the source material, and the opportunities that the project provides for new knowledge production. But making an academic argument within a virtual world is a bit more challenging. Yes, there are research questions that dovetail very nicely with it. I think of the Battle of Mount Street Bridge. I think of the Second Life World War II Poetry Archive, which is really awesome if it still exists in Second Life. Elaine Sullivan did a lovely exploration on the Egyptian bark shrine and its form and how it might move through Karnak on festival days. But I worry that the spatial frame has limited applications for research questions that's going to be problematic for us in the future. And if that's true, then that simple fact will kind of limit the scope of the scholarly digital editions we're looking to create. And in the next 2 days, I look forward to talking with all of you about all of these questions. Thank you.